welcome to the third, count them three, episode of Pop Art. My name is Howard Casner, and I'm your less than humble host. I'm an aspiring screenwriter and a script consultant. The basic idea of Pop Art is for my guests to choose a movie from the pop culture side of film, and I, in turn, will choose a more arty, older, foreign film that corresponds to it in some way. So for this episode of Pop Art, my guest, Jay Cluitt, has chosen the hysterically brilliant comedy Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I, in turn, have chosen the great Ingmar Bergman's art house classic, The Seventh Seal. This is probably so far the most divergent pairings of movies yet I've had, but it's early yet. You never know. At the same time, I think we'll find that these movies not only have a few things in common, they even have some things in common with the world today, with the coronavirus and everything. So to begin, why don't you, Jay, give an introduction?
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me on the show, Howard. As you've said, I am Jay. I am the host of the Lambcast. You had Richard on last week, my co-host, and the current shepherd of the Lamb, the large association of movie blogs, which is as it sounds, it's a large association of movie blogs. It's a big collection of film blogs from all around the world. I am in England. I did not found this. It was founded by Dylan Fields, who's in Arizona. But I took over the mantle a few years back, and I'm holding on to it with my fingernails ever since. No one else wants it, but hey, no one's fighting me for it, but it's mine.
It's a ring. It's my precious.
Exactly. It's my purpose for being. I have my own site as well, lifeversusfilm.com, where my main aim is to chronicle my watching of every film on the 1001 movies you must see before you die list, as well as a few other greatest film lists out there. Both of today's films appear on that list. My reviewing of them has dropped a lot. I haven't written any reviews for a few months, and before I used to do one every few days, and then it went to like one a week, one a month, one every 4 months, it seems. But I've got a lot of time on my hands at the moment for some unknown reason, and so I'm trying to make use of that, and hoping that watching 2 films for this podcast will spur me on to get back into reviewing a bit more.
Okay, so let's dive into the films. The first one we'll discuss is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I will start out with some information about the film. It was released in 1975. It was directed by Terry Gilliam, and the Terrys Gilliam and Jones, I say. I believe the animation is by Terry Gilliam. It's written by, the credit is Monty Python, but that is Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, Michael Palin, and also appearing in the movies Connie Booth and Carol Cleveland. So when did you first see the film, and tell us about your reaction to it?
I think I first saw it when I was about 14, which may be too young. I don't know. It really gelled with me at the time. I had a small group of friends at school who they started talking about Monty Python, and I just went, "What is this thing?" And I borrowed the musical album from them, went home, listened to it, loved it, and then I heard of this film. It was on TV. I recorded it. I watched it, and I loved it. It just kind of really struck a chord with me. It was a few years would go by until I saw Life of Brian, which many believe is better, but I think Holy Grail, being my first kind of introduction to Python, has always got that element of nostalgia to me. But it had been about a decade since I last saw it, I think. It's been a while.
Why did you decide to choose this film? What made you choose this film?
Well, you put out the call to pick a film with pop culture elements, and so I went to my site and looked down my list on the 1001 movies for people who died that I hadn't reviewed yet, and thought, which one of these that I really like have a big element of pop culture? I gave you a little selection. When you picked this one, I was very happy that you picked this one, because I hadn't watched it for a long time. I wanted to see it again, and it reminds me of kind of my childhood, and it just being something that I've seen many times.
I have noticed that one of the reasons why a lot of so far people have chosen their films is it reminds them of their childhood, and you can't argue with that.
Yeah, well, that's the films that stick with you, I think.
That's right. Yeah. So now that you've seen it again after 10 years, has your reaction changed? What do you think of it?
I think it's gone down a little bit. Some of the humour is quite juvenile, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right. It's not necessarily aimed at highbrow adult audiences. Some elements are, certainly, but some bits are just kind of come off as quite silly. But again, it's silly humour. So I remember it as being this 100% perfect masterpiece of comedy, where in actual fact it's very good, but I wouldn't recommend it to everyone. It's not everyone's type of humour. For instance, my wife has no knowledge of Monty Python, I would say, and she saw most of this film with me. She didn't make it to the end. She described it as being the weirdest film she's ever seen, and left just before the rabbit. So yeah, she left just before the rabbit scene, which is unfortunate because I really wanted her to see that scene.
This rabbit scene is pretty wonderful.
It's spectacular.
Yes.
Because especially the first time, you have no idea what's coming.
Well, I guess they read, they used a real rabbit, but they used someone's rabbit, and they weren't supposed to get anything on him, and they used this sort of fake blood that was terrible to get off. They just had an awful time getting off. And after the whole thing was done, they said, we could have just bought a rabbit.
Yeah, that might have been, well, that's still bad for whatever rabbit they use. It's still an ordeal for that rabbit.
Right.
being absorbed in this fake blood.
At least they wouldn't have had to say, oh, don't worry, we'll get it to you in a week after we send it through the washer or something. I first saw it when it came out. I was in college, and Monty Python was very big. Every Sunday night, it was Monty Python and Doctor Who. And I was there every Sunday night watching these. So I saw every Monty Python episode, I think, over and over and over again. And I even still watched them. And everybody loved it. We would, we would quote it, the knights who say knee, and it's just a scratch, and everything about a kind of sparrow carry coconut. A swallow,
yes.
Can a swallow carry a coconut, and which you can't, of course. And
I mean, two could if they string it together. No, that's not good. It's not.
Yes,
let's not just start quoting this film.
Yes. And I definitely thought, I was a big fan of Monty Python. I thought they were just brilliant. There's something about Britain, I think, that I don't think we've ever been able to do in the U.S., and I've never quite understood why. British shows and plays and TVs, they can be silly, but they're not just silly. They're sort of often brilliant silly. And I'm not sure why the British are able to do this so well. And I'm not just talking about Monty Python. I think Father Ted is
that's a good example. Yeah,
hysterical. And Miranda, I think, is so funny. And even things like, Blackadder.
Oh, yeah.
I just, do you have any idea why the British can be just so silly and get away with it? And I just can't think of anything in the U.S. where we do that.
Every time America tries to remake a British comedy, the only successful one is The Office, I think.
Right.
Which I'm not a huge fan of the British version, but I really like the American one. But yeah, the weirder things like the IT Crowd. The IT Crowd is a very silly comedy,
right.
And then you try and make it in America, and you've cast Joel McHale, I think, in the Chris O'Dowd role. Like, Joel McHale is a gorgeous figure of a man,
right?
And you can't put him in the Chris O'Dowd role. No offense to Chris O'Dowd, but he looks like a guy who works in IT, whereas Joel McHale is the boss's son who has never worked a day in his life.
That is one of the things that I often think that America, with a lot of these shows, are very bad at casting. I often think they're casting for people who would be great on Big Brother.
Yeah, that's why the show Extras is so good. The one I've only seen the first couple of seasons, but when it's about. Have you seen Extras?
Yes.
So transporting a British sitcom to America and making it a really photogenic cast, having Matt LeBlanc playing the Richard Griffiths role. It's perfect.
So, what are some of your favorite scenes? What might even be your favorite scene from?
Well, you mentioned the "Tis But a Scratch," the black and white scene. That's always one that's kind of stuck with me, just because it's silly, it's gory, but it's so terribly made. Where just like the sword barely grazes the shoulder and the arm just pops off, and there's this little trickle of blood coming out, which I think is part of the appeal of this film. Where the film was made for $400,000. I'm not sure.
Right.
I've got the American. No, I've got the British budget in front of me. I've got the American one.
They got about 10 people, a lot of them pop stars, to put in like $20,000 each. They got 10 or 20, something like that, to finance this movie because they couldn't get financed anyplace else. No one would make it.
So some things like them riding around on coconuts instead of horses. That's because they couldn't afford horses. So they just added into the great comedy. That's a very memorable bit. Whenever I have to deliver some plastic samples and prototypes at work, I tend to clop along like I've got coconuts when I'm going up the stairs, and just sticks with me. So yeah, I like the black and white scene. The help on being repressed. The peasants in the mud, just like it's the whole thing really.
I thought we were anarchists, socialists, whatever.
Yeah, it's just that whole breakdown of the different government styles that they could be having, from this guy who's covered in excrement digging around in a ditch.
I guess when it says you can tell he's nobility, why? Because he doesn't have any shit on him.
Yes.
Which I guess was one of the very few improvised lines in the whole movie. John Cluit says there really was no improvisation. I imagine there was improvisation it's basically a set of sketches. So they probably had some back and forth creating the sketch, but then once it's done, it's done. Monty Python is famous for having sketches that can be quoted verbatim back at them, which is always kind of struck me as funny that you have this troupe who are known for bucking
bucking the system and going against archetypes, and decades later people just retweet back at them exactly what they've been, parrot back exactly what's been heard before. So it's the antithesis of Python.
Yeah, I guess each the different episodes were written also, I guess, by different of the actual Python people, and that's often how it got cast. The Robin scene were written by so he
Eric
played
Idle.
Robin. Yeah,
Eric Idle played Robin. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Well, that's how they did the TV show as well, wasn't it? They would go up. They had little partnerships, I think. So Chapman and Cleese wrote together, I think. Palin and Jones, and I think Gilliam and Idle worked separately, just kind of individually. I think that's how it is. I could be wrong.
I think my favorite scenes would include the "I'm not dead yet."
Yes. Is there anything you can do? Swat.
Which I guess is played by the guy who plays the historical expert who appears in individual scenes in modern day. I think that's what I read. I like the she's a witch, she turned me into a newt.
I got better. Yeah.
I always love, for some reason, when God appears and he says, "What are you doing?" And we're averting our eyes. He says, "Well, stop." I hate it when people avert their eyes.
It's when they grovel, when they apologize.
I hate it when they grovel, And of course the rabbit.
Yes, of course the rabbit. But that the interaction with God, that's an element I've liked, where this film and indeed Life of Brian, they take apart religion as a concept, and none of the Pythons, as I am aware, are religious. They are John Cleese especially is very anti-religious, and so I do enjoy them looking at these kind of myths and stories and just breaking them apart.
They're pretty merciless about it at times. One thing I did like or find interesting, that there is actually a story here. If you watch their TV shows, only one or two that I remember ever really have a story that covers the whole thing.
Yeah.
Here they actually have a story.
It's kind of a loose story. It is essentially a series of sketches with a few similar characters, or the same characters running through it, because it's very episodic. And the story doesn't have an end. It's about to have an end, and they will get arrested.
That is true. And they really, as I find so happens in comedies like this, it happens in Blazing Saddles, it happens in Murder by Death and things like that. You sort of paint yourself into a corner. Where do you go? How do you possibly end it? And I think that's the one thing that doesn't quite work for me anymore. The historian that appears every once in a while, and then just a sudden, it just sort of ends. And I think even John Cleese and the others say, we just didn't know how to end it, so we just did it this way. That, and they couldn't afford the huge budget for a huge battle scene.
I can see that. I can't think of a way they could have ended it satisfyingly.
I do think that one place where Spamalot actually improves on the original.
I have not seen Spamalot. I'm very sad. By all means, spoil it. I'm very sad that I haven't seen it.
What it basically ends is they don't find the Grail, and King Arthur says, "It's all been a waste. I haven't been able to do anything. None of it. My kingdom's in tatters." And the other character says, "Well, don't look at it that way. Look on the bright side of life." What they do is they use the song from Life of Brian, "Look on the bright side of life."
That's perfect.
Yeah, and I think that is actually a much better ending. How do you did talk about A Life of Brian? How do you think this ranks, though, with all the other Monty Python?
It has been a long time since I've seen Life of Brian as well. I do really enjoy that one. Like I said, I would have put Holy Grail slightly above it, but I think I need to rewatch Life of Brian. It's also on the 1,001 list, so I will try and get to it soon. I think it's got a more coherent story. It's less sketch based and more plot. There is some sketch. There's aliens at one point, for Christ's sake. Always takes me by surprise. Oh, there's aliens. Okay, fine. I forgot about them. So I put Holy Grail first and Life of Brian. I do enjoy The Meaning of Life. So if you want to speak about a sketch-based episodic film, Meaning of Life is literally that. That's got some great songs in it as well. And now for something completely different, it's the sketch shows, it's the sketches from the show, which I saw all of those before I saw the TV show, so they were all kind of fresh to me. But if you like the show, then you're going to like the film, because it's the same thing pretty much.
Actually, there are a lot of concert films out there too as well. I guess that's how they really became big in the U.S. Because the show wasn't doing very well, and I can't remember, I saw a documentary on it, and someone did a concert film of them during this 60s or 70s when we were doing midnight shows and things like that. And at that point, that's when they really started taking off and becoming big in the U.S. And then there are also a couple of other movies that I guess aren't really Monty Python movies, but there's Jabberwocky, which I always really like, and Time Bandits.
Yes, Time Bandits is fun.
I think that's almost a rather brilliant film. Who's your favorite Monty Python?
That's easy. It's John Cleese. Yes. John Cleese he's long been a comedy hero of mine. I would watch anything he's in. Rat Race was the first DVD I owned. and I don't know if it's just because he's in it, but I really loved that film as a kid, and his eccentric millionaire made it a very entertaining viewing. But yeah, I'll see anything. 40 Towers, favourite TV show of all time.
I have to agree with you about John Cluit. Even when I see the television show, he always becomes the character. There's something about him where he stops being John Cleese, no matter what character he's playing, and he becomes John Cleese. For all the other actors, as much as I enjoy them, they almost never stop being themselves. You can always see them acting. You can always see the mechanics working.
I think that's definitely true of Graham Chapman, he's the lead in the two narrative-based Python films, mainly because he's not great at character work. He can do some, but he's got a limited range. He's good at playing himself and kind of a buffoonish everyman kind of thing, which that could well be himself. I don't know, but he's good as Arthur. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think he can do a lot else. He's like one of the heads in the three-headed knight, and that's about it.
But John Cleese always just seems to just become whatever character he's playing, and I've always admired that about him. I mean, he really seems to be a really good actor.
Absolutely, and a very physical one as well. Just like, the Ministry of City Walks and things that he did in 40 Towers. It helps that he's like 6.5 feet tall and made of pipe cleaners, so he's just real gangly and thin. But so he has a real presence on screen, whereas everyone else just kind of looks normal. They're just kind of average-looking guys. He's just this tall, lanky guy at the back. But yeah, if you think about some of the most memorable quotes from the film, most of them tend to come from Cleese. He's the Black Knight, he's the French taunter, Tim the Enchanter. He's some of the best characters. The whole "I fart in your general direction, your mother's a hamster, your father smelled of elderberries." That's iconic as being from this film.
I do think that it is a comedy, but in some ways it is interesting that now we're in the midst of a plague as well. and at least in the U.S. I don't know how...
we are here, don't worry.
No, I don't mean that. But I don't know how strong religion is in America, but religion is playing a huge part right now, especially because Trump is president and he has the support of the fundamental conservative evangelicals. So also religion is a huge thing in the U.S. right now, and so these are two of the huge themes. Well, I'm not sure the plague is a huge theme, but it's two parts of this movie we're actually witnessing and experiencing today.
That's very true.
Yeah, and might be good to have some laugh during this.
Yes,
period.
I certainly enjoyed watching this film and taking a break from the world at large. Yeah,
always good to have some comedy out there that you can just let go of. The other thing I kind of enjoy about it also, and this is true of all their films, is you can put it up and you can take it up and lay it down. This may be the first time I've seen it all the way through in one sitting. At other times, I'll just say, well, I think I'll just watch some scenes here and there from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I don't have to watch all of it, because you don't need to watch all of it for the individual scenes.
It doesn't make sense if you do watch all of it. It's fine.
And each scene sort of works on their own terms, and you can get all the humor out of it.
Yeah, definitely. You don't need to stick around for the whole thing. You can just duck in and out, watch someone get their arms chopped off, watch some people be attacked by a rabbit, watch an animator have a heart attack and the monster being written out of existence because the guy stopped animating it, and go on with your day.
Right. When it was released, it really didn't get particularly good reviews, at least in the U.S. The U.S. just, at least the reviewers, weren't getting it or understand it. They just said it was a bunch of silly scenes. Some worked, some didn't. I certainly think it's a lot better than that, because I think it is a bunch of silly scenes strung together. But I think, for me, even now, most of them still work very, very well. I find them extremely funny and extremely clever.
That's the problem with reviewing comedies, especially ones that are so esoteric as Python, where it's if you don't get it, it's just not for you.
I think even the show had trouble sort of finding an audience.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I was drawn to it, because this is certainly not my parents' kind of thing. So as a teenager, I was like, I'd watch this because they definitely wouldn't. I would try and talk to my dad about it. My dad likes his films as well, and he would just scoff at the idea of Monty Python being anything that could be enjoyed by us.
It did cost $400,000 to make. It earned $5 million.
That seems low.
This was
judging by the bad reviews. Then
in the 70s, if you adjust for inflation, who knows how much that is? But $5 million was a lot, especially over 400,000, and it was for more of a youth market. Apparently, it was a miserable shooting experience for all of them.
I can imagine. Yeah,
weather
just
was
trotting
awful.
around Scotland. Well, they were filming in Scotland, which. Scotland's a beautiful location, where the weather is terrible.
Yes. So, in sort of finalizing this, is there anything else you might want to add, or any other aspects of the film you might want to draw our attention to?
When Eric Idle, as when he gets shot with the arrow, his kind of message for you, sir. I had that as my ringtone for so long.
Oh.
My text message ringtone. Now it's just on. My phone's been on silent for 5 years.
Yeah.
But that was me as a kid having that as my ringtone. That's about it, really. We've covered everything else.
So let's then go over to a film that has but has some similarities in many ways, but is also very, very different.
Yes, it is.
Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. And now some information on that. It came out in 1957. It was Ingmar Bergman wrote it based on a play he wrote. It stars, I'll probably get some of these wrong, Gunnar Borström as the Squire, Bent Elleroth as Death, Max von Sydow as the Knight, E.B. Anderson as the actor's wife, Wills Pope as the actor. The title is taken from Revelation, and when the Lamb had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. And some people interpret that to mean that he was talking about the silence of God, which is one of the big themes in Bergman's film. So, when did you first see this film?
I first saw it a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I watched it with the intention of reviewing it.
Mm-hmm.
I did not review it. And I watched it for the second time earlier today. And I remembered nothing from that first time around. Apart from the iconic scene of Death and Max von Sydow playing chess.
Right.
Which is part of cinema history is that screenshot.
Right.
And I believe that screenshot is the reason that it's in the 1001 book. I'm not happy that you gave me an Ingmar Bergman film to talk about on the show, Howard. And I think you knew this was coming. I've never spoken about him before. I've seen 4 Ingmar Bergman films, and I do not feel qualified to talk about them because they're generally very heavy films.
Generally, there are a couple of exceptions, but yes.
But the other 3 that I've seen are Winter Light, Through a Glass Darkly, and Hour of the Wolf, and I liked none of them. Especially Winter Light, which I was terrible. But again, I believe my opinion to be wrong on this. I think these are probably far better films than I understand them to be. I'm just not qualified to comprehend them. I have no film studies training. I grew up. I liked watching films. I started writing about them. The end of my story. So they tend to do a lot with philosophy and religion, and people start talking and spinning around in circles as they speak about metaphors and philosophizing and the tenets of religion, and I just kind of start tuning out when that happens.
Well, I would have to respond to what you say by saying yes and no. I mean, yes, these are some of the greatest films ever made, and it's going to be almost impossible to dispute that because history always has the last say, and history pretty much has said, yeah, this is it. At the same time, your reaction to it is your reaction to it. You have absolutely every right. And I'm not sure that your reaction is all that different from a lot of, I guess, younger people who are seeing movies today. And I think there's a reason for that. I mean, for me, Seventh Seal was one of the first Ingmar Bergman films I saw. I saw it like in the 70s or 80s when I was in college. And it is one of my top 10 films of all times. But when I saw it in the 70s, existentialism had finally hit the U.S. Like all things, it came late because it hit France and Europe in the 40s and 50s. And then it suddenly hit. And, of course, one of the reasons was the Vietnam War. And another reason was that American artists, filmmakers, were taking these films very, very seriously. This was the time when foreign film really became big to the U.S. And filmmakers, people who were theatrical or filmmaking background, these were a lot of the films that they were seeing because these were something new, something different. We never had really seen them in the U.S. before. And they were talking about issues that were very, very important to us at the time. Is there a God? Does God exist? If he doesn't, what is the meaning of life? Is there any meaning of life? If there is no meaning of life, then what do we do? And Bergman also then influenced a lot of filmmakers, which then, of course, influences film goers. He was a big influence on Woody Allen. He was a big influence on Martin Scorsese and Paul Schrader. And you'll see traces of existentialism all throughout the movies with Kubrick and others during that period. Today, I was on a Bergman podcast with someone else where we were talking about his films. And I said, I don't think Bergman is of any importance or influence to filmmakers today. And I think he stopped being that in the 90s. And I think you can still see him in Europe with Miki Haneke and a few other filmmakers. But in the US, I think he's pretty much gone. Existentialism has gone to TV. You see it in shows like The Leftovers, in Westworld, in Rick and Morty, BoJack Horseman, even Doctor Who, I think, has become a lot more existential. Well, that's where people are talking, well, what is it to be a human being? What does it mean? Yeah, I mean, Rick and Morty and Doctor Who are at the total opposite ends of what the meaning of the universe is. But in movies, starting in 1990 with, I think, Spike Lee and Tarantino and the Coens and Kevin Smith and Steven Soderbergh, I don't think they could care less about these questions. I don't think it interests them at all, but I'm 65, so I grew up in this period. And I think possibly one of the reasons is that once you get through existentialism, which is, well, what is the meaning of life? And and the answer is, well, there is no inherent meaning of life, and we don't know if there's a God, and you choose your own meaning. Well, what do? You get past the angst and you get past the depression and everything, and you say, well, I got to get on living. And so now you have these filmmakers who are much more interested in making films about film, or that are influenced by film, or make genre pictures, or things like that. Theme isn't as important today as aesthetics is for me in filmmaking. I don't know if that makes sense, but that might answer why.
It does make sense, and that's not something I've really considered before. And I would say that theme, when I watch films, I don't tend to look out for themes very often. They don't mean much to me. I'm more concerned about the narrative and generally the enjoyment factor. I don't watch films as art. I watch films as entertainment, which sometimes is the same thing. But that does mean that things like the films of Ingmar Bergman, they're not for me. Right. I think would be a.
Well, I think that's true. I think we've reached. I can get all real intellectual about it, and I think we reached in the 90s a postmodernism where the theme isn't really that important. I mean, certainly Tarantino and Coens and the Coen brothers have an attitude toward life, but I don't really watch them for theme. I do watch them for, as you say, enjoyment, and it is possible to make art out of that, because I think both Coens and Tarantino are artists. Not everybody will agree with me, but I think the basic principle is still true, whether you agree with me about those.
I do agree with those particular ones, definitely. Yeah. Two of my favourite working director brothers.
But I doubt you could find any strains of existentialism or Ingmar Bergman or Antonioni or anything like that in those movies. I know that for The Marriage Story, I don't think he could have made that movie without having seen scenes from a marriage. But generally speaking, existentialism has come and gone, or as I said, it's moved to television. The last place I thought I would ever see existentialism take hold.
Now there's so much TV.
Yes.
So there's something out there for everyone, even the existential heads.
Right.
They have those as
one of the things that did happen and why TV got so good, here I am, I'll just lecture for all, whatever, what does it matter?
By all means, go ahead. I'm learning here.
We had the writer's strike in 2007, and all these writers went on strike, and so no movies were being made. So what they did is they started, and a lot of them really weren't that satisfied in what they were being allowed to write anyway for studios and things like that. They were just work for hire and things like that. So now this gave them an opportunity. Well, I have the time. I'm going to write whatever I want. And then all of a sudden HBO became really big, and all these streaming channels became really big, and TV is much more supportive of writers than directors. They were allowed to do all these weird things that they would never have been allowed to do in movies. And so I think that's why one of the reasons why they were finally able to allow all this to come out. But the only people you really see deal with existentialism is like Paul Schrader with First Reformed, and Martin Scorsese with The Silence, and even with The Informer, which basically says, well, what does it matter? We're all going to die anyway. So I feel you. I perfectly understand how you feel.
Good. I was concerned about coming on it today because your previous episodes have been quite intellectual discussions, and I cannot have one about Bergman because I don't understand what I'm watching, and I've tried to think about it and work it. I feel like there's a lot of metaphors and probably references to religious works. I'm not a religious person, so I don't have any knowledge in that area. And
even people who are religious don't really have this kind of religious feeling about it anymore. Well, God exists or he doesn't exist. We still got to live our life.
Yeah, it's not going to change anything.
But there are some
probably doesn't
parallels between the movies. Both take place during time of the plague, as they are now. Both of them deal with the question of God, and I thought what was also would be especially interesting for people here in Los Angeles. In The Seventh Seal, we have a troupe of artists, a troupe of actors who are trying to make a living during the plague, trying to find a place where they can keep doing their art.
When no one has money for art anymore.
And you can't go to certain cities because the plague is there. It's a matter of just staying alive. And one of the things about Ingmar Bergman, though, is that during his time, he was probably the most influential filmmaker of the time, so influential that he influenced pop culture to a huge amount. You can see a little bit even in Monty Python when you have the penitents coming through. Instead of flagellation, they hit themselves over the head with blocks of wood.
A block of wood.
And both Seventh Seal and Monty Python have a scene where a witch is questioned and is going to be burned at the stake. One of the things I always liked about the Monty Python sketch is at the very end, Connie Booth says, "It's a fair cop."
It's a fair cop.
So she was a witch after all. She really was a witch.
She weighed the same as a duck.
Yes.
What can you say?
And you can't argue. And sometimes the reasoning I see with people on Facebook with the modern plague now is the same. But you will see him in, if you see Roger Corman's The Mask of the Red Death, where he has Death dressed the same as in the movie, and he plays chess with one of the characters. He's in Woody Allen films. Last
Action Hero.
Yes, The Last Action Hero.
And Bill and Ted.
Yes, The Last House on the Left is a remake of a Bergman film called The Virgin Spring. And I think my favorite has to be Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey.
Yes, the great William Sadler playing Twister.
Where, they die, they go to hell, they're playing a series of games because death can't win. And it has absolutely my favorite line of that year when Death says, "You sunk my battleship."
Yeah.
Which I think sums it all up.
That is, I think I'm very familiar with Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey and Last Action Hero. Yeah. So I did go into this with some prior knowledge, but only from those two films.
Yes. A couple of other things I guess I'll mention. He had a very difficult time getting this movie made. No one wanted to finance it. But then he made a movie called Smiles of a Summer Night. And if you want to see an Ingmar Bergman that I think you might enjoy, this is a very, I think, funny comedy about people acting ridiculously when it comes to falling in and out of love.
That one is also on the 1001 list. I think he's got 9 films on the 1001 list.
And it's one of my favorite rom-coms. I think it's one of the top 5. It was made into a musical, Little Night Music, which I think is a wonderful musical. But it made I
will track it down.
It made so much money. It was such a hit that he could do anything he wanted. So then he made The Seventh Seal. And it won the Special Jury Prize at the Cannes Film Festival. And with that, he was on his way. There was just about nothing that could stop him, especially since he's like Woody Allen. He could always make his films for a relatively small amount of money, and they would always make a profit, some more than others, but they would always make profit. As long as they made a profit, he could keep on making movies.
Fair enough.
Max von Sydow became one of a big American star as well, first starting playing Jesus in The Greatest Story Ever Told. Up until his recent death, I mean, most famously for The Exorcist, 3 Days of Condor, he was in Shutter Island. He was just everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah, he's been in Star Wars now.
Yes. In Star Wars and on TV in Game of Thrones.
Yes, oh yeah.
Yeah. So he became very big in pop culture. There's also a short movie called Deduva, which was made at the time of Bergman. That's a satire of Ingmar Bergman films. That's also very funny, and was nominated for an Oscar. So I know that I'm not sure how much more there is to say now about Seventh Seal. I just do think it's sort of an interesting parallel to have both of these together, as so different as they are.
Yes, you said these are the most polar opposite films you've paired together.
Yeah.
I think it'll probably stay that way for a while. I can't imagine two more different films, really.
Right.
But between my viewings of these, I watched Congo.
Yeah.
The not great 90s Michael Crichton film. I think that trio is a trio of very different films. One you mentioned the kind of the similarities between the two. There is another one. They both have an insult fight in them.
Yeah.
Which it's my favourite scene from The Seventh Seal. That when all the characters kind of convalesce in the woods, and you've got the actor and the blacksmith having this kind of insult fight at each other. The insults they come up with, the perfumed powder puff and the awful cropped bastard of 7 mangy mongrels. Which immediately after the film, my dog started to eat something he shouldn't eat, and I called him an awful cropped bastard. So that's going to stick with me, I think.
Well, so you did get something out of the movie after all.
Yes. And I really enjoyed that scene, actually, with the Squire character, with Johns, kind of chiming in with some lines for the blacksmith to use, because he wasn't come up with any himself.
Yeah.
Johns is an interesting character going through, where he's just kind of a commenter on everything going on. He just has this kind of wry view of the world. He's not a great guy. He claims somebody for his housekeeper because he stopped her from being attacked and didn't rape her.
Right.
So he thought, oh, so you're mine now.
Yeah.
I could have raped you, didn't, you're mine. That's not how it works, I think. Maybe it was then. It shouldn't be. But I liked his comedy. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the three main characters are the actor, Jot, who sees things. He's the mystic. And then you have, the Squire, who, there's no point to anything. It's nihilistic. There's nothing. Who cares? And then you have the knight in between who's trying to figure out, well, who's right.
Yeah.
And he never, finds out.
No, he doesn't. Yeah. He's just asking questions the whole way through and then doesn't get an answer.
Right.
That's life.
That's life. That's life. And I think society now has sort of reconciled itself to that fact and sort of moved on. But yet, but...
Join us.
Yeah, come on, join, let's have some good ennui and angst while we're all self-quarantined.
Any reprieve that the Holy Grail gave me, watching The Seventh Seal took that right away. This dropped me back into the real world of the plague that we're in.
Well, I have to say, I don't know if he gets dark or not, but he does get dark. And you watch 2 of the 3 of what's called the Silence trilogy, and that's, I think you said, Through a Glass Darkly and Winter Light. Was that the ones? Yes. And then there's a third one called the Silence. And you see a progression in that movie where he goes from, well, maybe, actually, no, that's it. We're all alone.